Part 2, Western Civilization to 1914. Chapter 4, The Pattern of Change. In order to obtain perspective, we sometimes divide the culture of a society, in a somewhat arbitrary fashion, into several different aspects. For example, we can divide a society into 6 aspects: military, political, economic, social, religious, intellectual. Naturally, there are very close connections between these various aspects, and in each aspect there are very close connections between what exists today and what existed in an earlier day. For example, we might want to talk about democracy as a fact on the political level, or aspect. In order to talk about it in an intelligent way, we would not only have to know what it is today, we would also have to see what relationship it has to earlier facts on the political level, as well as its relationship to various facts on the other 5 levels of the society. Naturally, we cannot talk intelligently unless we have a fairly clear idea of what we mean by the words we use. For that reason, we shall frequently define the terms we use in discussing this subject. The organization of power. The military level is concerned with the organization of force, the political level with the organization of power, and the economic level with the organization of wealth. By the organization of power, in a society we mean the ways in which obedience and consent, or acquiescence, are obtained. The close relationships between levels can be seen from the fact that there are 3 basic ways to win obedience: by force, by buying consent with wealth, and by persuasion. Each of these 3 leads us to another level: military, economic, or intellectual, outside the political level. At the same time, the organization of power today, that is, of the methods for obtaining obedience in the society, is a development of the methods used to obtain obedience in the society in an earlier period. Major change in the 20th century. These relationships are important because in the 20th century in Western civilization all 6 levels are changing with amazing rapidity, and the relationships between levels are also shifting with great speed. When we add to this confusing picture of Western civilization the fact that other societies are influencing it or being influenced by it, it would seem that the world in the 20th century is almost too complicated to understand. This is indeed true, and we shall have to simplify, perhaps even oversimplify, these complexities in order to reach a low level of understanding. When we have reached such a low level, perhaps we shall be able to raise the level of our understanding by bringing into our minds, little by little, some of the complexities which do exist in the world itself. The military level in Western civilization. On the military level in Western civilization in the 20th century, the chief development has been a steady increase in the complexity and the cost of weapons. When weapons are cheap to get and so easy to use that almost anyone can use them after a short period of training, armies are generally made up of large masses of amateur soldiers. Such weapons we call amateur weapons, and such armies we might call mass armies of citizen soldiers. The age of Pericles in classical Greece and the 19th century in Western civilization were periods of amateur weapons and citizen soldiers. But the 19th century was preceded, as was the age of Pericles also, by a period in which weapons were expensive and required long training in their use. Such weapons we call specialist weapons. Periods of specialist weapons are generally periods of small armies of professional soldiers, usually mercenaries. In a period of specialist weapons, the minority who have such weapons can usually force the majority who lack them to obey. Thus a period of specialist weapons tends to give rise to a period of minority rule and authoritarian government. But a period of amateur weapons is a period in which all men are roughly equal in military power, a majority can compel a minority to yield, and majority rule or even democratic government tends to rise. The medieval period, in which the best weapon was usually a mounted knight on horseback, clearly a specialist weapon, was a period of minority rule and authoritarian government. Even when the medieval knight was made obsolete, along with his stone castle, by the invention of gunpowder and the appearance of firearms, These new weapons were so expensive and so difficult to use, until 1800, that minority rule and authoritarian government continued, even though that government sought to enforce its rule by shifting from mounted knights to professional pikemen and musketeers. But after 1800, guns became cheaper to obtain and easier to use. By 1840 a Colt revolver sold for $27 and a Springfield musket for not much more, and these were about as good weapons as anyone could get at that time. Thus, mass armies of citizens, equipped with these cheap and easily used weapons, began to replace armies of professional soldiers, beginning about 1800 in Europe and even earlier in America. At the same time, democratic government began to replace authoritarian governments, but chiefly in those areas where the cheap new weapons were available and local standards of living were high enough to allow people to obtain them. The arrival of the mass army of citizen soldiers in the 19th century created a difficult problem of control, because techniques of transportation and of communications had not reached a high enough level to allow any flexibility of control in a mass army. Such an army could be moved on its own feet or by railroad. The government could communicate with its various units only by letterpost or by telegram. The problem of handling a mass army by such techniques was solved partially in the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865 and completely by Helmut von Moltke for the Kingdom of Prussia in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. The solution was a rigid one. A plan of campaign was prepared beforehand against a specific opponent, with an established timetable and detailed instructions for each military unit. Communications were prepared and even issued beforehand, to be used according to the timetable. This plan was so inflexible that the signal to mobilize was practically a signal to attack a specified neighboring state, because the plan, once initiated, could not be changed and could hardly even be slowed up. With this rigid method, Prussia created the German Empire by smashing Austria in 1866 and France in 1871. By 1900 all the states of Europe had adopted the same method and had fixed plans in which the signal for mobilization constituted an attack on some neighbor, in some cases, as in the German invasion of Belgium, with whom the attacker had no real quarrel. Thus, when the signal for mobilization was given in 1914, the states of Europe leapt at each other. The rise of authoritarian government. In the 20th century the military situation was drastically changed in two ways. On the one hand, communications and transportation were so improved by the invention of the radio and the internal combustion engine that control and movement of troops and even of individual soldiers became very flexible. Mobilization ceased to be equivalent to attack, and attack ceased to be equivalent to total war. On the other hand, beginning with the first use of tanks, gas, high explosive shells, and tactical bombing from the air in 1915 to 1918, and continuing with all the innovations in weapons leading up to the first atomic bomb in 1945, specialist weapons became superior to amateur weapons. This had a double result which was still working itself out at mid-century. The drafted army of citizen soldiers began to be replaced by a smaller army of professional specialist soldiers, and authoritarian government began to replace democratic government. The political level in Western civilization. On the political level equally profound changes took place in the 20th century. These changes were associated with the basis on which an appeal for allegiance could be placed, and especially with the need to find the basis of allegiance which could win loyalty over larger and larger areas from more numerous groups of people. In the early Middle Ages, when there had been no state and no public authority, political organization had been the feudal system which was held together by obligations of personal fealty among a small number of people. With the reappearance of the state and of public authority, new patterns of political behavior were organized in what is called the feudal monarchy. This allowed the states to reappear for the first time since the collapse of Charlemagne's empire in the 9th century, but with restricted allegiance to a relatively small number of persons over a relatively small area. The development of weapons and the steady improvement in transportation and in communications made it possible to compel obedience over wider and wider areas, and made it necessary to base allegiance on something wider than personal fealty to a feudal monarch. Accordingly, the feudal monarchy was replaced by the dynastic monarchy. In this system subjects owed allegiance to a royal family, dynasty, although the real basis of the dynasty rested on the loyalty of a professional army of pikemen and musketeers. The rise of the nation-state. The shift from the professional army of mercenaries to the mass army of citizen soldiers, along with other factors acting on other levels of culture, made it necessary to broaden the basis of allegiance once again after 1800. The new basis was nationalism, and gave rise to the national state as the typical political unit of the 19th century. This shift was not possible for the larger dynastic states which ruled over many different language and national groups. By the year 1903 old dynastic monarchies were being threatened with disintegration by the rising tide of nationalistic agitation. These three, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire of the Romanovs, did disintegrate as a consequence of the defeats of the First World War. But the smaller territorial units which replaced them, states like Poland, Czechoslovakia, or Lithuania, organized largely on the basis of language groups, may have reflected adequately enough the nationalistic sentiments of the 19th century, but they reflected very inadequately the developments in weapons, in communications, in transportation, and in economics of the 20th century. By the middle of this latter century these developments were reaching a point where states which could produce the latest instruments of coercion were in a position to compel obedience over areas much larger than those occupied by peoples speaking the same language or otherwise regarding themselves as sharing a common nationality. Even as early as 1940 it began to appear that some new basis more continental in scope than existing nationality groups must be found for the new superstates which were beginning to be born. It became clear that the basis of allegiance for these new superstates of continental scope must be ideological rather than national. Thus the 19th century's national state began to be replaced by the 20th century's ideological bloc. At the same time, the shift from amateur to specialist weapons made it likely that the new form of organization would be authoritarian rather than democratic as the earlier national state had been. However, the prestige of Britain's power and influence in the 19th century was so great in the first third of the 20th century that the British parliamentary system continued to be copied everywhere that people were called upon to set up a new form of government. This happened in Russia in 1917, in Turkey in 1908, in Czechoslovakia and Poland in 1918 to 1919 and in most of the states of Asia, such as China in 1911. The economic level of Western civilization. When we turn to the economic level, we turn to a series of complex developments. It would be pleasant if we could just ignore these, but obviously we cannot, because economic issues have been of paramount importance in the 20th century, and no one can understand the period without at least a rudimentary grasp of the economic issues. In order to simplify these somewhat, we may divide them into four aspects: A. Energy, B. Materials, C. Organization, and D. Control. It is quite clear that no economic goods can be made without the use of energy and of materials. The history of the former falls into two chief parts, each of which is divided into two subparts. The main division, about 1830, separates an earlier period when production used the energy delivered through living bodies and a later period when production used energy from fossil fuels delivered through engines. The first half is subdivided into an earlier period of manpower and slavery, and a later period using the energy of draft animals. This subdivision occurred roughly about A.D. 1000. The second half, since 1830, is subdivided into a period which used coal in steam engines, and a period which used petroleum in internal combustion engines. This subdivision occurred about 1900 or a little later.